The German shepherd came out of the snow at dusk, thin, heavy with unborn pups, her ribs sharp beneath a coat dusted white. She stood at the tree line of a house that wasn't hers and watched the one lit window, where a former Navy SEAL had long since stopped letting anything get close. The man inside was Eli Marsh. He had carried wounded men out of places that don't have names. But he had not been able to carry his own wife off an icy road the night the world took her, and the child she was only weeks from holding. Since that night, he had let nothing near him again. But the dog kept coming back. Every evening she returned to the same spot in the falling snow. She never barked, never begged, never came a single step closer than the old fence post. She only watched, as if she were waiting for him to remember how to care about something again. Then, on the coldest morning of the year, she was gone. And the snow where she always stood was empty, except for one line of paw prints, leading straight toward the one building Eli Marsh had nailed shut 2 winters ago and swore he would never open again. If you've ever had an animal show up in your life at the exact moment you needed it, tell us about it in the comments. We'd love to hear. And if stories of loyalty, grief, and quiet miracles stay with you, subscribe and walk this one through with us to the end. Because some souls don't show up to be saved. They show up to do the saving. Snow fell soft over Hollies, Montana that winter, blurring the Flathead pines into pale gray ghosts and turning the gravel road past the marsh place into a clean white ribbon. Eli had always trusted weather like this. It hid the world without making it disappear. At 41, he was a tall, weather-worn man, broad through the shoulders, short dark hair going gray at the temples, with a quiet steadiness in the way he moved, like someone who had spent a long time standing straight when grief wanted him to fold. He kept the porch light on out of habit, not hope. He poured 2 cups of coffee each morning and emptied one of them down the sink, untouched, because 2 winters of doing it had worn the act smooth as a river stone. He no longer let himself think about why. The house behind him was full of rooms he didn't enter. One in particular, a small room off the back of the barn with a window that faced the mountains. He had built it himself in a better year with his own hands and a head full of plans. He had not crossed its threshold since the night the sheriff's truck came slow up his road with its lights off, which was how you knew in a town like Hollies that no one was coming home. So Eli had learned to live small. Wood in the stove, snow off the steps, coffee down the drain. A life narrowed down to the things that didn't ask anything of him. And then the dog came. He first saw her on an evening in early December when the light was failing and the cold had teeth. A shape at the edge of his tree line where the pines gave way to the open field, a German shepherd, gaunt and low to the ground, her belly swollen heavy beneath her. She stood perfectly still, watching the lit window of his kitchen. When he stepped onto the porch, she didn't run. She didn't come closer either. She simply held there in the falling snow the way a person stands outside a house they used to belong to. "Go on," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Nothing here for you." She watched him a moment longer. Then she turned and melted back into the dark trees. He told himself that was the end of it. But the next evening, at the same gray hour, she was back, same spot, same stillness, same patient eyes fixed on his window. And the evening after that, and the one after that. He started leaving food out without admitting to himself that was what he was doing. A bowl of leftover meat on the bottom step, then by the fence post when she wouldn't come to the steps. In the mornings, the bowl was always empty, the snow around it stamped with prints, but he never once caught her eating. She would not take a thing while he could see her, as if accepting it in front of him would cost her something she couldn't spare. He found himself watching for her. That was the part that unsettled him. He'd be splitting wood as the light went down, and his eyes would drift to the tree line before he decided to look. Some nights the wind came howling off the Flathead Range, and he'd lie awake thinking of her out there in it, thin and full of pups, and he'd be angry at himself for thinking of her at all. He had buried the part of himself that worried over living things. He had buried it on purpose. And here was this animal, dragging it back up out of the frozen ground a little more each night. "You're as stubborn as she was," he muttered one evening, and then went silent, startled by his own words, by the she that had slipped out into the cold air where he couldn't take it back. By the third week he had a name for her, though he hadn't meant to. He'd been carrying split logs past the bare willow tree by the fence, the one that bent low over the field, half broken by an old storm but still, somehow, alive, when he saw her standing right beneath its drooping branches, snow settling on her back. Willow, he thought before he could stop himself. A thing that should have gone down in the storm and hadn't. After that, she was Willow, and naming her made it harder to pretend she was nothing to him. One night near Christmas, the cold dropped so hard the trees cracked like rifle shots in the dark. Eli couldn't stand it. He pulled on his coat and carried the bowl out himself, all the way to the fence post, and crouched there in the snow with it held out in both hands. Willow stepped out of the trees. Slowly, one careful paw at a time, her eyes never leaving his, she crossed the open ground she had never crossed before. She came close enough that he could see the gray in her muzzle, the ice crusted along her flank, the way her sides moved with the breathing of the lives she carried, close enough to touch. He did not reach for her. Something in him understood that reaching was the one thing that would end it. So he stayed still, the bowl in his open hands, and let her decide. She ate, right there in front of him for the first time, trembling, watching, but eating. And when she finished, she lifted her head and looked at him, a long, steady look that went straight through the wall he'd spent 2 winters building, and Eli Marsh felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought was frozen shut for good. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, girl, you can stay." He went to bed that night, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he left the porch light on like he meant it. The next morning, the world was white and silent, and the temperature had fallen straight off the bottom of the thermometer. He pulled on his boots and went out with the bowl, his breath clouding in front of him, already half smiling at the thought of her at the fence. The fence post was bare. The spot where she always stood was untouched, no willow, no waiting shape against the trees, just smooth, unbroken snow. Eli stood very still, then he saw them. A single line of paw prints, pressed deep and hurried, leading away from the field, not toward the trees where she always vanished, but the other way. Across the yard, around the side of the barn, straight to the door of the one room he had nailed shut 2 winters ago and sworn on everything he had left that he would never open again. The prints ended there, at that door, and from the other side of it, muffled and small in the enormous winter quiet, came a sound that stopped his heart cold. For a long moment, Eli could not make his hand move toward the door. It was a plain door, weathered pine, a iron latch he'd set himself, 2 crossed boards he had nailed over it the week after the funeral so that he would never, in a weak hour, be able to open it without meaning to. The nails had rusted. Snow had drifted against the bottom. And on the other side of it, low and broken and unmistakable, came the sound again. A thin, urgent whimper, and beneath it the labored panting of an animal in the middle of something it could not stop. Willow. He had the claw end of the hammer in his hands without remembering crossing the yard to the tool shed for it. The first nail shrieked as it came loose. The second fought him. The third board he simply tore down with his hands, splinters biting into his palms, not feeling them. Then the latch lifted, and the door he had sworn never to open swung inward, and Eli Marsh stepped into the room he had built for a child who never came. He had braced himself for the grief of it, the little shelf he'd sanded by hand, the window facing the mountains, the corner where a crib was meant to stand. But he had no time for any of that. Because there in the corner, on a pile of old burlap and the spare canvas tarp he'd left folded years ago, lay Willow, and around her, impossibly small, blind, and squirming, were 3 newborn pups and a 4th still coming. She lifted her head and looked at him, not afraid, not warning him off. She looked at him the way the drowning look at the one person on the shore, help or don't, but I have nowhere left to go. She had crossed his whole yard in the killing cold and clawed her way to the one sheltered, wind-tight room on the property to do this. Of all the places in the world, she had chosen the room he had sealed against his own heart. "Easy," Eli breathed, dropping to his knees beside her, the hammer forgotten on the floor. "Easy, girl, I've got you. I've got you." He had pulled men back from the edge of dying. His hands knew how to be steady when everything else was screaming. He cleared the membrane from the third pup's face, rubbed its tiny chest with the rough pad of his thumb until it gave a sputtering, indignant squeak and began to breathe. He kept his voice low and even the way you talk to something that has decided whether or not to trust you. The fourth pup came, and then it was done, 4 small lives steaming faintly in the cold air, blind mouths searching, and Willow's great ribs heaving with exhaustion as she began, gently, to clean them. The room was too cold. He knew it the way he knew the weather. The pups were already shivering, and shivering newborns in Montana in December did not have long. He needed something warm. Wool, now, and that was when he saw it. On the shelf he had built with his own hands, where it had sat untouched through 2 winters because he had never once been able to come in here and move it, a small wicker basket. And folded inside, pale as winter sunlight, the half-finished baby blanket. Hannah's blanket. She had been knitting it the autumn she died, sitting in the lamplight with her belly round and her needles clicking, humming something with no tune. He could still hear the click of those needles if he let himself, which was exactly why he never let himself. It ended mid-row, the last loop still on the needle, a length of pale yellow yarn trailing off into nothing, a thing she had set down meaning to pick back up, and never had. For 2 years he could not have touched that blanket to save his own life. He had nailed a door shut rather than risk having to look at it. Now 4 newborn lives were shaking themselves toward death 6 feet away from it. His hand trembled as he reached up and lifted it from the basket. It was lighter than he expected. It smelled of cedar and dust, and faintly, impossibly, still of her. He slid the needle free, and the last stitch held Hannah's work, not coming undone, and he knelt back down and gathered 4 cold little bodies into the soft, pale yellow she had made for a child she never got to hold, and tucked them in close against their mother's warmth. The shivering eased. The smallest one gave a sigh and went still in that sudden, total way that newborns sleep. And Eli Marsh sat back on his heels on the floor of the room he had sealed against the world and put one hand over his mouth and finally, 2 winters too late, let himself weep. He did not hear the truck on the road. He did not hear the boots in the yard. He only heard the soft knock at the open door and a woman's voice, careful and kind, say his name. "Eli, your gate was open in the snow. I just wanted to make sure." The voice stopped. He turned. Ruth Calloway stood in the doorway, a paper sack of something from the feed store still in her arms, snow melting in her gray-streaked hair. She had known him a long time, the way people in small towns know each other, from a distance, with respect, without prying. She had lost her own husband 4 winters back. Folks said she ran the feed store now more to have somewhere to go in the mornings than for any love of grain prices. She was looking past Eli to the dog, to the pups, to the pale yellow blanket that half the town had known Hannah was making. Ruth Calloway took it all in. And to her great and lasting credit, she did not say, "Oh, Eli," and she did not say, "I'm so sorry," and she did not say any of the soft, useless things people say. She simply set her paper sack down in the snow on the step, came in, knelt on the cold floor across from him with the new little family between them, and said quietly, "Well, looks like you're going to need more towels than that, and about 4 times the food that dog's been getting." She looked up at him, her own eyes bright. "I've got both at the store. I'll bring them out tonight." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in 2 years, precisely because it asked nothing of him and assumed he would go on living. He found he could not answer. He only nodded. Ruth reached out and very gently ran one finger along the back of the sleeping, smallest pup. "She chose well," she said softly, and Eli understood she did not only mean the room. "Dogs know. They go where the warmth is even when they can't see it from outside." She glanced at him, just a glance there and gone. People are slower about it. That night she came back with towels and feed and a thermos of soup she pretended was just leftovers, and the two of them sat on the floor of the once-sealed room while the stove ticked warm and 4 pups nursed in Hannah's blanket. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. 2 people who had each learned the particular arithmetic of an empty house, sitting in the one room that had been closed the longest, watching new life breathe. Eli named the smallest pup that night, the one that had gone still and sighed in the blanket first. He called her Hope and felt foolish, and Ruth pretended not to notice the crack in his voice when he said it. For 3 days, it was something close to peace. Willow grew stronger. The pups fattened and squeaked and blindly shoved at one another. Eli left the porch light on and meant it, and found himself, twice, humming something with no tune. On the 4th day, a different truck came up the gravel road, older, rust along the wheel wells. A man behind the wheel Eli didn't recognize. It rolled to a stop at the foot of his drive and idled there a moment too long, the way a vehicle does when the person inside is working up to something. Then the door opened, and a lean, hard-luck man in a thin jacket stepped out into the snow, looked up at the barn, and called across the yard in a voice that was trying hard to sound certain. "That German shepherd you got back there, black and tan, real distinct white mark on her chest." He took a step closer. "I think you've got my dog, and I've come to take her back." The man's name was Dale Hooper, and up close he looked like someone the last few years had not been kind to. He stood at the foot of the drive with his hands jammed in the pockets of a jacket too thin for the weather, his jaw set, his eyes flicking past Eli toward the barn like a man checking whether a thing he wanted was still there. "Black and tan," he said again. "White mark on the chest, shaped kind of like a leaf. She answers to Belle. I lost her off the back of my truck up near Kalispell, end of summer. Been looking ever since." Eli did not move from the porch step. 2 winters of letting nothing close had made him slow to give anything up, and the thing in the barn was, he was startled to realize, the first thing in a long time he was not willing to lose. "She's got pups," he said. 4 of them, born 3 days ago in my barn. She's in no shape to go anywhere, and neither are they." Something crossed Dale's face at the word pups, calculation, maybe, or just surprise, and Eli didn't like it. "All the more reason," Dale said. "Pups got value." "That's my dog and her litter, and I aim to—" "You aim to nothing today," Ruth said. Neither man had heard her come around the side of the barn. She stood there with her arms folded, gray hair loose, looking at Dale Hooper the way a schoolteacher looks at a boy she's already decided is lying. "If that dog's yours, you can prove it the right way. There's a vet in town and a county office and a microchip scanner, and we'll let those sort it out like civilized people. But you do not walk onto a man's land and carry off a nursing mother in a snowstorm on your say-so. Now get back in your truck before you freeze in that excuse for a coat." For a moment, Dale looked like he might argue. Then the cold, or her certainty, or something underneath both, took the fight out of him. "This isn't finished," he said, but quietly, more tired than threatening, and he climbed back into the rusted truck and back down the drive, tires hissing in the snow. Eli let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "He'll be back." "He'll be back," Ruth agreed. "Men like that always come back when they've decided something's owed to them. We'll deal with it the right way and we'll win." She looked at him. "But Eli, that white mark on her chest, it is shaped like a leaf. You saw it too." He had. He said nothing. That night the storm that had been threatening for a week finally came down off the mountains in earnest. It came the way the bad ones come in the Flathead. Not as snow at first, but as wind. A long, rising howl that bent the pines and rattled the barn's tin roof and found every gap in every wall. By midnight, the power was gone. Eli lit the old kerosene lamps and fed the stove and went out 3 times through the screaming dark. A rope run from the porch to the barn door so he wouldn't lose his way in the white, to check on the little family. Each time Willow lifted her head and thumped her tail once against the blanket, and the pups were a warm knot against her belly, and he let himself believe they'd make it through till morning. It was on the fourth trip, near 3 in the morning, that he knew something was wrong. Willow was up, pacing the small room, whining low, nosing at the pups, and then turning away, agitated in a way he hadn't seen. And the pups, 3 of them shoved and squirmed and complained as always. The fourth did not. The smallest, Hope. She lay a little apart from the others, and when Eli scooped her up into his palm, she was cold. Not the bright cold of the room, cold the way the others weren't, a deep, wrong stillness, her tiny sides barely moving, her squeak when he rubbed her chest gone thin and almost soundless. He'd seen newborn animals fade like this. He'd seen it happen in an hour. A chilled newborn's body simply forgot how to keep its own fire lit, and once it dropped past a certain point, it did not come back on its own. She needed warmth, and she needed it now, and she needed more than the stove could give her fast enough. She needed a vet, fluids, a heat source, things he did not have in a dark house at 3 in the morning with the road drifted shut and the phone lines down with the power. "No," Eli said to the room, to the storm, to the small, cold life in his hand. "No, not this one, not you." And here was the thing that undid him, kneeling on that floor. He had felt this exact helplessness before. A cold road. A wife he couldn't reach in time. A child weeks from breathing who never got the chance. The same iron fist closed around his chest now that had closed around it 2 winters ago, and for one black moment he was back there entirely, useless, too late, watching the most important thing in the world slip through hands that had been trained to save everyone but the ones who mattered most. He could have folded. Part of him wanted to go numb, to let the old verdict be true: you are a man who arrives too late. Instead, he moved. He pulled Hope inside his shirt against the bare skin of his chest, the way you warm a hypothermic thing, his own heartbeat against her cold little body. He wrapped them both in Hannah's yellow blanket. He banked the stove to a roar. And then he did the only other thing he could think of. He held the smallest pup against his heart, and he did what he had not done since he was a boy and his grandmother made him. He spoke to her, low and steady and unbroken, half talking and half something older than talking, telling her she was not allowed to go, that he had not opened that door and let her into the warm only to lose her in the dark, that she was named Hope for a reason and she was going to keep it. The wind screamed. The lamp guttered. And against his chest, slowly, so slowly he thought at first he was imagining it because he needed it so badly, the small body began to take heat from his. A shiver ran through her, which was good. Shivering was good. Shivering meant the fire was catching again. A thin squeak, then a stronger one. A blind mouth working against his skin. By the time the gray light came up over the storm-broken mountains and the wind finally began to die, Hope was nursing again at her mother's side, indignant and alive, as if she had never in her life intended to do anything else. Eli sat against the wall of the room he'd sworn never to enter, hollowed out, shaking, the spent blanket across his knees, and watched the 4 of them in the new light. He had not been too late. This time his hands had been enough. Ruth's truck ground up the half-cleared road just after dawn. She came into the barn, took one look at his face, at the lamp burned down to nothing, the blanket, the way he was sitting, and understood most of it without a word. "We almost lost the little one," he managed. "But you didn't." She crouched beside him and put a hand on his shoulder the first time she'd touched him and left it there. "You didn't, Eli." He nodded. He couldn't speak. After a while, looking at the pups and not at her, he said the truest thing he'd said in 2 years. "I didn't think I had it in me any more, to be in time, for anything." Ruth was quiet a moment. "Grief makes a liar out of a man about himself," she said. "Tells him he's the one thing that's broken past fixing. It told me the same about me." She squeezed his shoulder once and stood. "It's wrong. It's just very, very convincing." That morning, for the first time, Eli let her stay for the second cup of coffee instead of pouring it down the sink. They drank it on the floor of the open room, between the stove and the sleeping dogs, and outside the storm pulled back off the valley and left it scrubbed and shining and quiet. He thought the worst was behind them. He was wrong. Because while the storm had been busy nearly taking Hope, It had also drifted the back road shut and stranded a rust-wheeled truck a half-mile down the county line. And its driver had spent the long, cold night in that truck with the heater dead, and a great deal of time to think about a barn full of dogs that he had decided, rightly or wrongly, the world owed him. And what Dale Hooper had decided by morning was that he was done asking. Dale Hooper came back 2 days later, and this time he did not come alone, and he did not come to ask. He came with paper. Eli was in the yard splitting the last of the dry wood when the rusted truck nosed up the drive, and behind it, to his surprise, a county sheriff's department SUV. His stomach tightened. Dale climbed out with the stiff, righteous walk of a man who believes he has finally gotten the law on his side, and held up a creased folder like a flag. "Vet records," Dale said before he'd even reached the porch. "From a clinic up in Kalispell last summer. German Shepherd female, black and tan, white blaze on the chest shaped like a leaf brought in for a torn pad. Listed owner Dale Hooper, that's me." He slapped the folder against his palm. "And I filed a found dog claim with the county the day after I first came out here, so this is all legal now. That's my dog in your barn, and those are my pups, and I've got a deputy here to see I leave with them." The deputy, young, uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere else on a cold morning, spread his hands. "Mr. Marsh, nobody wants trouble, but he's got records showing prior ownership, and you've got an unchipped stray that showed up on your land. In a dispute like this, with documentation on one side and none on the other, the county's going to lean toward the man who can prove he had her first. I'm sorry, that's just how it reads." Eli looked at the folder. He looked at Dale's face, and what he saw there was not cruelty exactly. It was need. The hungry, cornered need of a man who had lost a long string of things and had fixed on this one as the thing that would finally break the streak. But need or not, the records were real. The leaf-shaped mark was real, and Eli Marsh, who had spent 2 winters learning that wanting something badly enough did not mean you got to keep it, felt the old cold settle into his gut. Ruth had come out onto the porch. She read the situation in a glance. "How long?" she said to the deputy, not pleading, just measuring the ground. "Before anything happens, what's the timeline?" The deputy shifted. "There's a process. He files, Mr. Marsh can contest it. There's a review at the county office." He glanced at Dale, then back. "Realistically, you've got till the end of the week, Friday. The county'll make a determination Friday, and whoever it lands on, that's who takes the dog. I'd strongly suggest you two don't settle it any way but that one." Friday, 4 days, a clock started ticking. Dale wasn't finished. "I'll be back Friday with the paperwork stamped," he said, "and I'll take what's mine, and there won't be a thing either of you can do about it." But even as he said it, even wrapped in the law, even winning, his eyes kept sliding to the barn, to the warm, dark doorway where a sound of small squeaking carried out across the snow. And for just a moment, something flickered across his hard face that did not match his words at all. Then it was gone. He got in his truck. The deputy followed, and they were gone down the white road, leaving 2 sets of tire tracks and a dead line behind them. Eli stood in the yard a long time. "Has the records," he said finally. "He has the law. Ruth, he might actually have her. That mark, the timeline fits. What if she really is his, and I'm the one trying to keep a man from his own dog?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching the steam of her breath. "Then let me ask you something," she said. "That dog crossed your whole yard in a killing cold and clawed into a sealed room to have her babies where it was warm and safe. She had every mile of these mountains to run to. She came here. To you." She turned to face him. "A dog doesn't do that for the man who left her on the back of a truck. She did that because somewhere in that animal's heart, this is the place she decided was home. The county scanner can read a microchip, Eli. It can't read that." That night, Eli could not sleep. He went out to the barn near midnight with a lamp, not to do anything, just to be near them. Willow lifted her head and watched him cross the room and lower himself to the floor beside the blanket. And then, for the first time, she did something she had never done. She rose, careful of the pups, crossed the small space and lay down again with her great head resting across his knee. The full, warm weight of her. A trust, finally, completely given. Eli put his hand on her head and felt the leaf-shaped patch of white under his fingers and understood, sitting there in the lamplight, that he was not going to be able to give her up. Not because the law was wrong. Maybe it wasn't. But because somewhere in the last cold weeks, without deciding to, without permission, he had let this animal and her 4 impossible pups all the way into the place he had nailed shut against the entire world. And a man cannot unopen a door like that once it's open. He had tried once to keep from caring, precisely to avoid a Friday like the one coming. It hadn't worked. It never works. "I'm not going to lose you too," he told her very low. "I don't know how yet, but I'm not." He spent the next 3 days fighting it the only ways he knew how. He drove into town and sat in the county office and filed his contest and answered their questions. Ruth came with him and spoke for him, and the woman behind the desk wrote things down and would promise nothing. He asked around about Dale Hooper, and the picture that came back was not of a villain but of a sadder, smaller thing. A man who'd lost his work when the mill cut shifts, lost his place, been drifting from town to town, the dog the last thing he'd had before everything came apart, and her getting away from him the final straw that broke something in him. People who'd crossed the street to avoid Dale also, when pressed, felt a little sorry for him. It made it worse somehow. It would have been easier if he'd simply been cruel. Thursday night, the night before the county's decision, the temperature began to drop again, and a new front came sliding down off the peaks, and the radio in Eli's kitchen crackled out a warning. Heavy snow, falling fast, a hard freeze behind it. He stood at the window watching the first flakes come down past the porch light and felt the weather in his bones the way he always had. He checked the barn one last time before bed. 4 pups, warm in yellow wool. Willow's eyes following him to the door. "Tomorrow we'll know," he told her. "Whatever happens, you're warm tonight." He did not know that down the county road, Dale Hooper, who had no determination yet, no stamped paper, but a head full of the fear that Friday might not go his way after all, was sitting in his cold truck looking up the dark road toward the Marsh place, deciding that the surest way to win a dog on Friday was to already have her by Friday morning. And he did not know that the storm now coming down over Holly's Wood before that morning put one small life out in the killing dark, and force every one of them to decide, once and for all, what they were truly willing to risk for something that wasn't, by any paper in the world, theirs to keep. Beat 5, the climax, all is lost too. It happened in the blackest part of the night, and it happened fast. Dale Hooper came up the drive on foot a little after 2, headlights off, his truck left idling down on the road so the engine wouldn't wake anyone. He was not, in his own mind, a thief. He had spent the cold hours in the truck talking himself into a story where this was only taking back what was his, a day early, to spare everyone the ugliness of Friday. He came to the barn, and he eased the door open, and in the dark he reached for the dog. But Willow did not know this man as her old owner. She knew him as a stranger looming over her 4-day-old pups in the dark, and she came up off the blanket snarling, a sound of pure maternal fury, and in the chaos of it, Dale stumbling back, the lamp knocked from the shelf, the door banging wide on its hinges. One small thing slipped out into the night that should not have. Hope. The smallest pup, the one Eli had warmed back to life against his own heart, squirmed loose in the scramble, tumbled off the edge of the blanket, and in blind newborn panic wriggled through the open barn door and out into the snow, into the storm, into a cold that could end her in minutes. Eli woke to the snarling and the bang of the door and was out of the house in his boots and coat before he was fully awake, the rope line forgotten, the porch light a small, useless smear in the howling white. He found Dale frozen in the barn doorway, white-faced, staring at the dog, at the empty place in the blanket at the open door. "One's out," Dale said, his voice gone hollow with horror at what he'd set in motion. "The little one, it got out. It went." He pointed into the screaming dark, toward the field, toward the tree line. It went that way. For one heartbeat, the two men stood there, the one who had come to take, and the one who had everything to lose, and every bit of the anger Eli had a right to feel rose up in him and then fell away because there was no time for it. There was only a 4-day-old life somewhere out in a storm that killed grown men, and the cold that was already counting down. "Lamp," Eli barked. "Now, and the truck's spotlight, pull your truck up," pointed at the field. And Dale Hooper, who had come to steal a dog, turned and ran to help save her child. What followed, Eli would never be able to fully put in order afterward. The white wall of the storm. The beam of Dale's headlights swung up across the field, catching the snow in a long cone of light. Willow, who would not be kept in the barn, who shouldered past every attempt to hold her and plunged out into the dark after her pup, nose down, the only one of them whose senses were equal to the night. Eli following the dog, because the dog knew, calling Hope's name into a wind that tore the word away the instant it left his mouth. The field went down toward the willow tree and the half-frozen creek beyond the fence, and that was where Willow led them, to the low, broken willow bent over the field, the tree that should have gone down in a storm years ago and somehow never had. And there, in a hollow at the base of the trunk where the snow had drifted, and a newborn had instinctively burrowed toward the only shelter in a quarter-mile, was a small mound of white going still. Eli went down on his knees and dug with his bare hands and came up with her, Hope, ice in her fur, barely a flutter left in her. The second time in a week this scrap of a life had decided whether or not to stay. He pulled her into his coat against his chest, the old motion now, heat to a cold thing, and turned to fight his way back uphill through the drifts toward the light. And the wind shifted, and the creek bank gave. It was Dale who saw it first from the truck, the snow-loaded edge above the water sloughing loose under Eli's weight, the man and the pup pitching sideways toward the black current that never quite froze. Dale was out of the truck and across that field faster than a man his age in a thin jacket had any business moving. He hit the bank flat on his belly with his arm out just as Eli went down, and his hand closed on the back of Eli's coat. And for a long, straining, screaming moment, the only thing between Eli Marsh and that freezing creek was the grip of the man who had come to rob him. "I've got you," Dale gasped, hauling, his boots digging for purchase in the snow. "I've got you, give me your hand, I've got you." And he did. He pulled them up, the seal and the pup tucked in his coat, back from the edge, back onto solid ground, the three of them and the dog collapsing together in the snow while the headlights blazed and the storm raged on, indifferent, around the small, impossible fact that everyone was still alive. They got back to the barn half carrying each other. They got the stove roaring. And for the second time in a week, Eli held the smallest pup against his bare chest and willed his own warmth into her, Hannah's yellow blanket around them both. Only this time he was not alone on the floor. Ruth was there, her truck having clawed up the road when she saw the lights. And Dale Hooper sat against the far wall, soaked and shaking and staring at his own hands as if he'd never seen them do something like that before. When Hope finally squeaked, thin, furious, alive, something broke in Dale that had been a long time breaking. He put his face in his wet hands and he wept, the ugly, graceless weeping of a man who has been holding too much for too long. "I wasn't gonna hurt her," he said into his palms. "Either of 'em. She was the last thing I had that was mine, you understand, before everything went. The mill, the house, my everybody. She was the last thing that was mine. And when she got loose off that truck, I figured if I could just get her back, maybe I could get," he stopped, shook his head. "Maybe I could get the rest of it back, too. Stupid. A dog can't carry all that." The barn was quiet except for the stove and the storm easing off outside. It was Eli who finally spoke. He looked at the man across the room, the man who'd come to take everything, and had instead just put his own body between Eli and a frozen creek, and he found that the thing he'd been gripping so hard for 4 days had quietly changed shape in his hands. "She's not the last thing you've got," Eli said. "Look at what you just did. A man who'd lost everything that mattered doesn't crawl out on a breaking creek bank for a stranger's dog and a stranger's pup. That's not a man with nothing left, Dale. That's a man who forgot what he still had in him." He paused. "I know the feeling, believe me." Dale looked up. And outside, unnoticed by any of them, the storm blew itself out, and the first thin gray of Friday morning began to come up clean and quiet over the Flathead Range. The morning of the decision, the morning everything was supposed to be lost or won, arriving at last over a barn full of people who no longer wanted what they'd come for. It happened in the blackest part of the night, and it happened fast. Dale Hooper came up the drive on foot a little after 2, headlights off, his truck left idling down on the road so the engine wouldn't wake anyone. He was not, in his own mind, a thief. He had spent the cold hours in the truck talking himself into a story where this was only taking back what was his, a day early, to spare everyone the ugliness of Friday. He came to the barn, and he eased the door open, and in the dark he reached for the dog. But Willow did not know this man as her old owner. She knew him as a stranger looming over her 4-day-old pups in the dark, and she came up off the blanket snarling, a sound of pure maternal fury, and in the chaos of it, Dale stumbling back, the lamp knocked from the shelf, the door banging wide on its hinges. One small thing slipped out into the night that should not have. Hope. The smallest pup, the one Eli had warmed back to life against his own heart, squirmed loose in the scramble, tumbled off the edge of the blanket, and in blind newborn panic wriggled through the open barn door and out into the snow, into the storm, into a cold that could end her in minutes. Eli woke to the snarling and the bang of the door and was out of the house in his boots and coat before he was fully awake, the rope line forgotten, the porch light a small, useless smear in the howling white. He found Dale frozen in the barn doorway, white-faced, staring at the dog at the empty place in the blanket at the open door. "One's out," Dale said, his voice gone hollow with horror at what he'd set in motion. "The little one, it got out, it went." He pointed into the screaming dark, toward the field, toward the tree line. "It went that way." For one heartbeat, the 2 men stood there, the one who had come to take, and the one who had everything to lose, and every bit of the anger Eli had a right to feel rose up in him and then fell away because there was no time for it. There was only a 4-day-old life somewhere out in a storm that killed grown men, and the cold that was already counting down. "Lamp," Eli barked. "Now, and the truck's spotlight, pull your truck up," pointed at the field. And Dale Hooper, who had come to steal a dog, turned and ran to help save her child. What followed, Eli would never be able to fully put in order afterward. The white wall of the storm. The beam of Dale's headlights swung up across the field, catching the snow in a long cone of light. Willow, who would not be kept in the barn, who shouldered past every attempt to hold her and plunged out into the dark after her pup, nose down, the only one of them whose senses were equal to the night. Eli following the dog, because the dog knew, calling Hope's name into a wind that tore the word away the instant it left his mouth. The field went down toward the willow tree and the half-frozen creek beyond the fence, and that was where Willow led them, to the low, broken willow bent over the field, the tree that should have gone down in a storm years ago and somehow never had. And there, in a hollow at the base of the trunk where the snow had drifted, and a newborn had instinctively burrowed toward the only shelter in a 1/4 mile, was a small mound of white going still. Eli went down on his knees and dug with his bare hands and came up with her, Hope, ice in her fur, barely a flutter left in her. The second time in a week this scrap of a life had decided whether or not to stay. He pulled her into his coat against his chest, the old motion now, heat to a cold thing, and turned to fight his way back uphill through the drifts toward the light. And the wind shifted, and the creek bank gave. It was Dale who saw it first from the truck, the snow-loaded edge above the water sloughing loose under Eli's weight, the man and the pup pitching sideways toward the black current that never quite froze. Dale was out of the truck and across that field faster than a man his age in a thin jacket had any business moving. He hit the bank flat on his belly with his arm out just as Eli went down, and his hand closed on the back of Eli's coat. And for a long, straining, screaming moment, the only thing between Eli Marsh and that freezing creek was the grip of the man who had come to rob him. "I've got you," Dale gasped, hauling, his boots digging for purchase in the snow. "I've got you, give me your hand, I've got you." And he did. He pulled them up, the seal and the pup tucked in his coat, back from the edge, back onto solid ground, the three of them and the dog collapsing together in the snow while the headlights blazed and the storm raged on, indifferent, around the small, impossible fact that everyone was still alive. They got back to the barn half carrying each other. They got the stove roaring. And for the second time in a week, Eli held the smallest pup against his bare chest and willed his own warmth into her, Hannah's yellow blanket around them both. Only this time he was not alone on the floor. Ruth was there, her truck having clawed up the road when she saw the lights. And Dale Hooper sat against the far wall, soaked and shaking and staring at his own hands as if he'd never seen them do something like that before. When hope finally squeaked, thin, furious, alive, something broke in Dale that had been a long time breaking. He put his face in his wet hands and he wept, the ugly, graceless weeping of a man who has been holding too much for too long. "I wasn't gonna hurt her," he said into his palms. "Either of 'em. She was the last thing I had that was mine, you understand, before everything went. The mill, the house, my everybody. She was the last thing that was mine. And when she got loose off that truck, I figured if I could just get her back, maybe I could get," he stopped, shook his head. "Maybe I could get the rest of it back too. Stupid. A dog can't carry all that." The barn was quiet except for the stove and the storm easing off outside. It was Eli who finally spoke. He looked at the man across the room, the man who'd come to take everything, and had instead just put his own body between Eli and a frozen creek. And he found that the thing he'd been gripping so hard for 4 days had quietly changed shape in his hands. "She's not the last thing you've got," Eli said. "Look at what you just did. A man who'd lost everything that mattered doesn't crawl out on a breaking creek bank for a stranger's dog and a stranger's pup. That's not a man with nothing left, Dale. That's a man who forgot what he still had in him." He paused. "I know the feeling, believe me." Dale looked up, and outside, unnoticed by any of them, the storm blew itself out, and the first thin gray of Friday morning began to come up clean and quiet over the Flathead Range. The morning of the decision, the morning everything was supposed to be lost or won, arriving at last over a barn full of people who no longer wanted what they'd come for. Friday came in soft and bright, the way the world sometimes apologizes for a hard night. The county office opened at 9. By 1:15, 3 vehicles were parked outside it in the plowed slush, Eli's truck, Ruth's, and Dale Hooper's rust-wheeled wreck, and the woman behind the desk looked up, plainly braced for the fight she'd been promised on Wednesday. The fight did not come. Dale stepped up to the counter first, turning his cap in his hands, and set his creased folder of vet records down on it. "I'm here to withdraw my claim," he said. "On the German Shepherd and the litter out at the Marsh place. The dog's not mine anymore. Maybe she was once, she isn't now." He pushed the folder an inch further across the counter, like a man letting go of a rope he'd been hanging onto past the point of sense. "She picked her home. I'm not going to be the one to drag her out of it." The woman blinked, looked from Dale to Eli to Ruth, and clearly unused to people leaving her office with less conflict than they'd brought in, wrote it all down. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the cold, clean sun, the 2 men stood not quite knowing what to do with each other. "You didn't have to do that," Eli said. "Yeah, I did." Dale squinted out at the white mountains. "Been a long time since I did something I didn't have to. Felt better than I remembered." He scuffed at the snow. I'll be moving on. Heard there's work down in Missoula warehouse thing, honest enough. Eli was quiet a moment. Then, before you go, the runt, the little one that got out twice, Hope. He looked at Dale. When she's weaned in a few weeks, she's yours if you want her, not as the last thing you've got. He held out his hand. As the first thing of what's next. Dale Hooper stared at the offered hand for a long moment, and then he took it, and his jaw worked, and he could not get a single word out, and he didn't need to. The room came in the spring. Eli did not nail the door shut again. He could not have explained, even to Ruth, the exact morning he decided, but somewhere in those weeks of warming pups and shared coffee and a storm survived, the sealed nursery had stopped being a tomb and started being simply a warm room where good things had happened. So when the snow finally pulled back off the valley and the willow by the fence put out its first stubborn green, Eli carried his tools in there for the first time in 3 years, and he finished it. Not as a nursery. As a room that faced the mountains and let the morning in. He built low shelves and a wide bench by the window, and he gave it quietly a purpose. A place for animals that needed somewhere warm to land. Strays. The old, the sick, the thrown away. The ones nobody else had room for. Ruth helped him paint it. They did not talk about what it had been. They talked about what it would be. And if on the day they hung the door back properly on its hinges, Eli stood a moment too long in the spot where a crib was once meant to go, Ruth simply came and stood beside him and put her hand in his and let him. It was the first time he had held anyone's hand in 3 years. It would not be the last. Willow stayed, of course. She had chosen this place before any of them. She was only waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Her pups grew fat and clumsy and then long-legged and ridiculous, tearing across the spring field, and 3 of them went to homes Ruth vetted herself, to a widower across the valley, to a family whose own old dog had passed, to a young man home from somewhere hard who needed, a doctor had said, something to take care of. Each one going where the warmth was. And Hope went to Dale, who drove up from Missoula on a clear May morning in a truck that no longer rattled quite so badly, in a jacket that actually fit, and knelt down in the green grass while a half-grown shepherd barreled into him hard enough to knock him flat, and laughed. This hard-luck man laughed like something in him had finally thawed all the way through. Eli watched it from the porch with Ruth, and a cup of coffee he did not pour down the sink. He thought about the night the dog first stepped out of the tree line, and how sure he'd been that he had nothing left to give a living thing. He thought about the door he'd swore he would never open, now standing open to let the morning in. He thought about how he had spent 2 winters believing he was a man who arrived too late, and how a starving stray had walked across his whole frozen yard to prove him wrong, choosing his sealed-up heart for the one place in all the mountains warm enough to bring new life into the world. That, he understood now, was the thing he'd had backward the whole time. He'd thought, that first cold December, that the dog needed saving. That he was the strong one with the lit window and the food bowl, and she the desperate thing at the edge of the dark. But she had never come to be saved. She had come to do the saving. She had crossed that field every night not to take something from him, but to wait, patient as grace itself, for a broken man to remember that he was still capable of love. Some souls are like that. They show up at the worst, coldest hour of your life, ask for nothing, and quietly hand you back your own heart. If there was a God in it, and Eli, who had stopped believing in much, found that spring that he believed in this, then maybe that was how grace mostly came. Not in thunder, not in answers, but on 4 cold paws out of the snow at dusk to a window with one light still on. The willow by the fence still stands, bent and unbroken, greener every year. And on winter evenings now, when the snow comes down soft over hollies and the light fails early, you'll find that little room off the barn glowing warm against the gray, full of the old and the strays and the thrown away, the ones who just needed somewhere to land. Eli leaves the porch light on every night now. On purpose. Like he means it. Because you never know, he'll tell you, who might be standing out there at the edge of the trees, waiting in the cold for someone to remember how to care. If this story touched something in you tonight, do something for me before you go. Reach over and tell someone you love that you're glad they're still here. And if there's a door in your own heart you've kept nailed shut, maybe let this be the winter you finally open it. You never know what's waiting on the other side to bring you back to life. Thank you for spending this time with us, and for having the kind of heart that stays to the end of a story like this one. May your home be warm, may your losses be gentle with you, and may you always have some loyal soul on 2 feet or 4 who shows up out of the cold to remind you that you were never as alone as grief told you that you were. Take care of each other. We'll see you next time.